folks. Welcome to the PIDE webinar. This is Nadeem Haque. As you know, we do a lot of webinars. Steve, we do a lot of webinars. We're a very old think tank, Pakistani think tank, which is on the ascendant now. And one of the reasons it's on the ascendant is we do a lot of webinars and we invite people like you who are very kind to join us. It's a pleasure to have you here. You're really doing us a great favor, and we really need to hear from people like you. And we have a lot of, good people who come and talk to us. So thanks for that. PID is trying to help make policy in Pakistan. I'm sure you're aware that Pakistan is always in a mess. So that's the way we are. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome Steve Landsburg. Steve Landsburg is a extremely well-known author, although he's a mathematician, but he's an extremely well-known author of The Armchair Economist. And I was just telling him, he was in Chicago at the same time I was there, and he attended the same classes with Becker, Lucas, etc., and he was clever enough to write that book, which became a bestseller. So Steve has written a couple of other books, also done his mathematics, kept his mathematics going. So he's a professor at the University of Rochester, which is a great university. So I think Steve is going to talk to us about why do we need economists? Steve, that's a question I'm asking myself too. Do we need economists at all? So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you say. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Steve. Go ahead.
Thank you. Let me work on sharing my screen here, just a moment. I teach economics in the United States to college students. And I recently gave some of my exam questions to GPT-4, which is the state-of-the-art version of ChatGPT, the artificial intelligence. That's the logo for ChatGPT there. It got every one of my questions wrong. Every one of my exam questions, ChatGPT got the wrong answer. But it got the wrong answers in sort of interesting ways, and I'd like to give you some examples. Here's the first question I gave it. I said, suppose you suspect that oil companies are colluding to keep gasoline prices high, and then you do some research, you learn that gasoline consumers are quite insensitive to price. What should you conclude from that, true or false? This makes the collusion hypothesis more plausible. Here's what ChatGPT did with that. It explained to me what collusion is. It explained to me how colluders are able to charge monopoly prices. It explained to me why monopoly prices are higher than competitive prices. It also explained that if consumers are very price insensitive, there's a lot more to be gained from colluding. All of those things are true. And then it concluded that, yes, this does therefore make the collusion hypothesis more plausible, which is the opposite of the truth. Because what it overlooked is that colluders raise the price and keep raising the price to the point where consumers are not price insensitive anymore. If consumers are price insensitive, successful colluders will raise the price higher and higher and higher until you won't see the consumers being price insensitive. The customers of a monopolist are always price sensitive. The demand curve for a monopolist good is always elastic. It's very interesting what it did. It understood all the background material. It explained the background material to me accurately, but it was not able to apply that material in a thoughtful way. And it did that over and over. Here's the next question. The next question said, apples are provided by a competitive industry. Pears are provided by a monopolist. Coincidentally, they sell at the same price. You're hungry, and you don't care whether you eat an apple or a pear. You care about conserving societal resources. Which should you buy? Here's what GPT said for that. It explained to me why competitive industries are more efficient than monopolists. It said that if inefficiency is bad, inefficiency means you're wasting resources. It was right about that. And then it said, therefore, you should support the competitive industry by buying an apple rather than a pear. In other words, it knew that monopolies were inefficient. It didn't understand why they were inefficient. In a competitive industry, the price is a pretty good indicator of the value of the resources that are being used to produce the product. In a monopolized industry, a lot of the price is just markup. The actual marginal cost of producing goods under monopoly is less than the price. So if you care about consuming goods of the lower value, you would want the product that's produced at the lower marginal cost, and that's going to be the pear, not the apple. Once again, the bot understood all the theory behind this, but was not able to apply that theory accurately. One more question. I said that in the land of Nod, some mythical land, everyone's identical. Every day, 100 of them line up to buy peanuts at a controlled price. One day, the government decides that it's going to start giving out free coffee to everybody in line. It costs $1 to produce the coffee. The people drinking the coffee value it at 75 cents a cup. And the question was, what's the social cost of providing that free coffee? Again, the bot gave me all kinds of interesting and accurate explanations of what social cost means. But then when it went to compute this social cost, it said, well, the coffee is $1 a cup. People value it at 75 cents a cup. That's a loss of 25 cents. So that's 25 cents per person times 100 people. That's $25. What the bot overlooked completely is that when you start handing out free coffee to people in line, more people are going to attempt to join that line. And there's going to be more competition to get into that line. People are going to have to get up earlier in the morning. All of these things are social costs. When you give something away for free, people are going to compete for it until the value of the thing they're getting at the margin is no greater than the cost to them of getting it. Given the extreme assumption here that everyone's identical, all the benefits of the free coffee are going to be dissipated completely. And so the social cost of the coffee is the cost of producing it. It's $100. Once again, the bot was able, it was a lot like many of my weaker students. It was very good at sounding smart, but it wasn't very good at being smart. And let's talk about why that matters. You know, I said something about my weaker students. A lot of them learn how to sound smart. They don't learn how to be smart. I want to contrast that with my stronger students. A lot of my stronger students, the ones who have learned to think a little more deeply, have gone on to become influential economists, influential policymakers, and a lot of others have become informed and thoughtful citizens and voters. They got that way by mastering ways of thinking that don't come naturally to the artificial intelligence bots and don't come naturally to most human beings. Because not everybody is well trained in thinking like an economist, we get a lot of bad outcomes. Here's an example. You might remember that we recently have been through a pandemic. Relatively early in the pandemic, after about a year or so, vaccines became available. But there weren't enough vaccines to go around. So there was a question of how to allocate them. I'm not sure how you handled that in Pakistan. But the way we handled it in the United States was that we required people to sign up for an appointment using the internet. But of course, the demand for appointments far exceeded the supply. So usually you logged onto the internet and there were no appointments available. And before long, the entire United States looked like this. We were all hunched over our computer screens, reloading the page, reloading the page, reloading the page. You would sit there for hours reloading the page until finally it came up and said there was an appointment available, and then you grabbed it. Okay. That was crazy. It was an incredible waste of resources. You had the entire country spending their entire day doing nothing but this. That was crazy. This was even crazier. Once you did manage to snag an appointment, you were not allowed to sell it to somebody who valued it more. If you were happy curling up with a book, you couldn't sell your spot to someone who was desperate to get out and dance. If you were an accountant who worked well from home, you couldn't sell your spot to a construction worker who needed to be on site. And right at the height of all this, I attended a talk by a prominent economist who was advising the authorities on how better to allocate the vaccines. he had devised a very complicated algorithm. It looked a lot like this. It had everything in it that you could possibly imagine, except for prices. So I asked him where the prices were. And here's what he said. He said there were no prices in his allocation mechanism because he had learned from experience that the instant you say the word price, everyone who's not an economist stops listening. So even though this prominent economist had a pretty good idea of how to solve the allocation problem, he didn't dare to reveal his solution because he was afraid that nobody would listen. It kind of made me wonder why he bothered. If there's one insight that economists bring to the table, it's this. It is insane to try to allocate a scarce and valuable resource without using prices. That is true. It is profound. It has enormous implications for human happiness. To most of us, it is obvious, but to almost everyone else, almost everyone who's not an economist, to them, it's obviously false. What's obvious depends on how you think. What's obvious to the economist is often exactly the opposite of what's obvious to everybody else. Let me give you a few more examples of that. At the end of every semester, my students fill out these evaluation forms to say what they thought of me. I'm not sure if you have the same thing in Pakistan, but here in the United States, pretty much all college professors face this at the end of the semester. Students fill out these forms. You know what's the best way to score high on those evaluation forms? According to the data, it helps a lot to be physically beautiful. Beautiful teachers consistently earn the highest scores. So my question is why? Why do the most beautiful teachers get the best ratings? When I ask this question among the faculty in other departments, my friends in the English department or the history department or the physics department, the modal answer they give me by far is that students are shallow. In fact, obviously students are shallow. But I suspect the opposite is true. I think if you bring a little economic thinking to bear, you're more likely to conclude the real reason beautiful teachers get the best ratings is that beautiful teachers are better teachers. There are at least two reasons to expect that. There's a minor one and a major one. The minor reason is that the teacher who takes the trouble to comb his hair is probably also the teacher who takes the trouble to prepare his lecture. But the major reason is more rooted in economics. Beautiful people have a lot of career opportunities that the rest of us don't have. Not just in acting and in modeling, but in pretty much any business where you have to deal with the public. There are, in retail, in beautiful real estate agents close more deals. Retail stores like to put the most beautiful people at the cash registers. So a beautiful teacher, on average, is somebody who gave up a whole lot of opportunities for the privilege of teaching. On average, that's a person who's passionate about teaching. And when you're passionate about something, you tend to be good at it. Those of us with more ordinary looks, maybe some of us just went into teaching because it was the best of a bad lot of outcomes. I always tell my students that if you show me a lighthouse keeper with movie star good looks, I will show you the world's best lighthouse keeper, because anybody who gave up a career in the movies to keep a lighthouse must really love lighthouse keeping. And the same applies to teachers. Another question where what's obvious to the economist and what's obvious to everyone else might be very different. At adoptive agencies around the world, in many different cultures, adoptive parents show a marked preference for girls. They ask for girls. They want to adopt girls, not boys. Why is that? Why do adoptive parents consistently ask for girls? The answer I get most often when I ask people that question is that obviously parents prefer girls, or parents on average prefer girls. Sometimes you ask this question of somebody a little more perceptive who says, oh, no, This doesn't prove that parents in general prefer girls. It only proves that the kind of parents who are looking to adopt prefer girls. So a better answer is that the adoptive parents prefer girls. I don't think that follows either. I think actually what we're seeing in the data here is more consistent with the hypothesis that adoptive parents prefer boys. Think about it. In a world where most people prefer boys, what kind of children do you see at the adoptive agencies? Boys don't get put up for adoption generally unless there's something really wrong with them, a health problem, a behavioral problem, something like that. A lot of girls get put up for adoption just because they're girls. So even if I go to the agency and I prefer boys just like everyone else does, I still might prefer a healthy, well-adjusted girl to an unhealthy, poorly adjusted boy, and that's what's going to drive what we see in the data here. Okay, my next question, and this is my favorite question. Why do people stand still on escalators but not on stairs? I love this question because nearly everybody thinks the answer is obvious, and nearly everybody gets it wrong. The modal answer, the answer I hear most often, is that if you stand still on the stairs, you never get anywhere. That's obviously false. You can test that for yourself. Go stand on the stairs for 5 minutes, then start walking, and you will eventually get someplace. Of course, what people really mean when they say this, is not that if you stand still on the stairs, you'll never get anywhere. Well, it is true that if you stand on the stairs forever, you never get anywhere. But that's irrelevant to the question because nobody stands still on the stairs forever. Nobody stands still on an escalator forever either. What we want to compare is taking a 1 minute break on the escalator with taking a 1 minute break on the stairs. So now what people say when they think a little more carefully is they say, oh, but if you take a 1 minute break on the stairs, you are foregoing an opportunity to make some progress. If you take a 1 minute break on the stairs, you are foregoing an opportunity to make some progress. That is true. It is also true that if you take a 1 minute break on the escalator, you forego an opportunity to make exactly the same amount of progress. Check it out. If you walk 100 yards per minute and you break for a minute on the stairs, at the end of that minute, you will be 100 yards behind where you would have been. If you break for a minute on the escalator, you will be 100 yards behind where you would have been. Those breaks are equally costly. So the so-called obvious answers don't work. Let me just illustrate that and make sure we all understand what's going on. Here are my friends, Alice and Bob. They're standing on the ground floor. They're about to take the escalator, but this is kind of a weird escalator. It breaks a lot. Sometimes it stops, sometimes it starts, it goes for a while, it stops for a while. Sometimes it's an escalator, sometimes it's basically a staircase. Alice rests for 2 minutes on the escalator while it's moving. Bob rests for 2 minutes on the stairs while the escalator is not moving, while it's a staircase. They take their breaks. She takes her break while it's moving. He takes her break while it's still. Who gets to the top first? Answer, they get to the top at exactly the same time. They have to get to the top. You can check out the math. You don't have to do that. The point is, both their breaks cost them the same amount. They have to get to the top at exactly the same time. So that now, I hope we begin to see that there's actually a question here. If those breaks are equally costly, why do we see people more willing to take breaks on escalators than we do on stairs? Now we have a question. Before I can address that question, and I will, I first need to ask exactly how costly were those breaks? How costly were those breaks? Well, here are Alice and Bob again. They're at the top of the escalator now. They've reached the first floor. And ahead of them, we see Ghost Bob and Ghost Alice in the place where Alice and Bob would have been if they had not taken their breaks. This is where they would be if they had not taken their breaks. What's the cost of the breaks? The cost of the breaks is that Alice and Bob now have to make up the distance between where they are and where their ghosts are. They have this extra red part to travel over now. The cost of a break depends on the cost of traveling that red area. The cost of a break depends on what's ahead of you. If that red area happens to be a staircase, these breaks were pretty costly. You're going to have to make up for them by climbing stairs. If that red area happens to be an escalator, the costs were relatively cheap. You can make up for them on an escalator that does most of the work for you. The cost of the break depends on what's ahead of you, not on what's behind you. So here again are Bob and Alice entering the stairs, entering the escalator. If Bob takes a break on the first part here, if he takes a break on the stairs, he's going to have to make up for that break on the stairs up here. If Alice takes a break on the escalator down here, she's going to have to make up for it on the escalator up here. Why is Bob's break more costly than Alice's? Why is he less willing to take a break? It's not because of the stairs he's currently on. It's because of the stairs that are ahead of him. And if that sounds like maybe I'm just playing with words, let's mix it up a little. Let's change the story so that at some time while they're on these stairs and escalators, at some specific moment, let's say at 12:15 exactly, the stairs will start moving and become an escalator. The escalator will start moving and become a staircase. Here's what happens at the exact moment of 12:15. Bob and Alice have each taken a break at this point. Bob is behind Alice. Bob is behind Alice because he's been on a staircase and she's been on an escalator. Here are their ghosts showing where they would have been if they had not taken breaks. The distance between Bob and his ghost is the same as the distance between Alice and their ghost because they both took the same 2-minute break. But now, because of the switch, Bob is no longer on stairs, he's now on an escalator. So he is going to get to make up this distance pretty fast. Alice is going to have to make up the distance a little slower. Here, for example, is what the arrival times at the top might look like. Bob is going to end up at the top 1 minute behind his ghost. Alice is going to end up at the top 2 minutes behind her ghost because they're making up the same distance. She's making it up on stairs. She's making it up on an escalator. The cost of Bob's break is less than the cost of Alice's break. If every escalator turned into a staircase while you were on it, and if every staircase turned into an escalator while you were on it, you would take your breaks on the escalators, not on the stairs. The cost of the break depends on what's ahead of you, not on what's behind you. So why don't people stand still on staircases? Because on a staircase, there's usually a staircase ahead of you. But if we switched that up, people would take their breaks on the stairs. Again, it all depends on what's ahead of you, not on what's behind you. And let me just take a moment to mention that if your answer to the original question relied in any way on the observation that when you stand still on the stairs, you're not making progress, your answer was absolutely, unequivocally, and irredeemably wrong. But almost everyone gets this question wrong. In fact, they deny that there's a question in the first place. And that happens, that same phenomenon happens a lot of time with other questions that are a lot more important than this one. For example, I like to ask people whether they believe the world is overpopulated. And the answer I get time after time after time is that obviously the world is overpopulated because there is a limit to the number of people the earth can support. This is the person who denied the question. Of course, there's a limit to the number of people the earth can support. We all know that. What that tells us is that there is such a thing as too many people. It does not even attempt to address the question of whether the current number of people is too large or too small. I see this over and over again. Again, I saw it with the ChatGPT. I see it with my weaker students. They give you a correct answer to the wrong question. Or they deny the question is interesting in the first place. But a lot of questions that, and I hope I've given some examples already where it looks like the answer is obvious. If you think a little deeper, you can learn a lot that's valuable and important. One more example. Why do people diversify their charitable contributions? These are the logos of many different charities that we have in the United States. I'm sure you have some of these in Pakistan and many others in Pakistan as well. Why do people give $1 to the Red Cross and another dollar to the Cancer Society and another dollar to the Hope Foundation instead of bulleting their contribution on the one charity that they care about the most, or the charity they think is most likely to do some good? The answer I hear to that most often is that it's because people care deeply. They care so deeply about all these different things that they want to support all these different things because they care so deeply about them. I want to argue that that answer makes absolutely no sense. Here's why. These are pictures of all of the starving cats in the world. I want you to imagine them lined up in order of how much help they need, how much you care about helping them. The very first cat there, that's the one that is most deserving of your assistance, and then the second and the third, and so on up to the 10 millionth, because there are a lot of cats in the world. There is very little difference between the first cat and the second cat. Out of 10 million cats, the first and the second are pretty much indistinguishable. So here are all the world's starving puppies, also lined up in order. And you're going to help one of them. You wish you could help them all, but you're going to help one of them. Who are you going to help? Well, you think hard about it. You think about the starving cats. You think about the starving puppies. You're not sure where your contribution is going to do the most good, but you play the probabilities, and given the probabilities and given how much you care and given how much you think is needed, you end up deciding to save a cat. You spend $100 and you save a cat. And now you want to save another animal. And you decide to save the first dog. And I say you must have just made a mistake, because you decided that the first cat was more worthy than the first dog. The second cat is just like the first cat. If the first cat was worthier than the first dog, then so is the second cat. Wrong slide there. If you saved the first cat and then the first dog, you made a mistake. You should have saved the second cat instead. So why do people diversify? My first theory is they diversify for exactly the opposite of the reason that was given, not because they care deeply, but because they are motivated by something other than charity. They like getting thanked, for example. They like getting a thank you note from the Cat Foundation and getting another thank you note from the Dog Foundation. Somehow it makes them feel better to diversify their contributions like that, motivated not by what's good for the cats and dogs, but by what's good for themselves. A second possibility is that they have sort of delusions of grandeur. They say to themselves, oh, okay, I saved a cat, that solved the world's cat problem, now I can move on to the world's dog problem. The same kind of delusion of grandeur that might, for example, make people do things like vote. And the third possibility is that people sometimes overlearn. They've learned a good rule of thumb. A good rule of thumb is that you should usually diversify. That's a really good rule of thumb most of the time. It does not apply in this case. Why not? Look, if these were small charities, if it was one cat versus one dog, you would want to diversify. You give the cat a bowl of milk. Now the cat is not the same cat anymore. It is well fed, or it's at least better fed than it was before. Now you might want to move on to the dog. If you are funding a local theater group, you give them enough money to put on one play. Now they've put on a play. The second play is maybe much less important than the first play, so you don't want to fund their second play. That makes sense. With small charities, it makes sense to diversify. With your own finances, it makes sense to diversify because you are a significant contributor to your own finances, just like you're a significant contributor to that local theater group. You are not a significant contributor to these big worldwide charities, and so the argument for diversifying does not apply. Is a mistake people often make. They overlearn. They learn the right rule of thumb, They learn the reasons for that rule of thumb, but then they forget that sometimes those reasons don't apply. And again, this is the sort of mistake that I keep seeing those chat GPT bots making. So overlearning was my other theory. I want to give you one more example before I draw some conclusions. There's an experiment. Which was done first at the University of Arizona, but it's been repeated many times. And it involves two subjects placed in isolation under ideal conditions. They don't know anything about each other. They can't see each other. So I put these blue boxes around them here to indicate that they cannot see each other. They have no contact. They know nothing about each other. They don't know anything about each other's personal characteristics, at least if the experiment is done right. And then an experimenter gives this one, let's call her Minnie, the one on the left, gives her a pile of dollar bills. And he asks her if she would like to give some of those dollar bills away to Mickey over here. And the extra incentive is that every time Minnie sends $1 to Mickey, the experimenter will add another $2. So that every time she gives $1, he gets $3. For the price of $1, she can make this stranger $3 richer. In real-world experiments, Minnie sends a lot of money, typically on the order of 35% of what she's got. That is way more than she is willing to send in an experiment where the donations are not triple. It's tempting to look at that and think that Minnie is motivated partly by altruism, and in particular, that the incentive of Mickey getting, she cares how much money Mickey gets. She's willing to spend a little bit when she's giving him $1 at a time. She's willing to spend a lot more when she's giving him $3 at a time. So it looks like she really cares about other people. She cares how much he gets. The more he gets, the more she's willing to give. It looks like altruism. A lot of authors have said that this looks like altruism. She cares about making strangers richer. In my opinion, that is flat out crazy, because Minnie is acting as if she has either forgotten or just doesn't care that every single dollar that Mickey gets comes from some other stranger. Maybe this other stranger is the taxpayer who is funding the experiment. Or maybe it's the potential subject who never gets to sit in Mickey's box because all the money gets used up. Right? The experimenter's got a certain amount of money. He does the experiment until the money's used up. Mickey uses it all up. This guy never gets to play. Somebody is giving up those dollars that Mickey is getting are coming out of somebody's pocket. And Minnie is acting as if she doesn't care about that at all. She's, sorry, having a little problem with my slides. Here we go. Remember, she's not supposed to know anything about this stranger in the booth here. She doesn't know anything about him. She doesn't know anything about this person who the money is coming from. There's no reason to favor one of these people over the other, and yet she does. That seems to me like a very hard thing to explain. Minnie is paying for the privilege of redistributing income from one total stranger to another. And I only see two explanations for that. One is that Minnie just loves redistributing. Okay? It's just redistributing for its own sake. She doesn't care who the winners and losers are. She just likes shuffling other people's money around. That sounds pretty weird, but the alternative is weirder. The alternative is that Minnie is a magical thinker who believes that the wealth she is distributing comes literally from nowhere. I'm not sure which one of those theories is correct. Either one of them makes me really wish that Minnie were not allowed to vote. But, you know, if we want to sort of pry into what's going on in Minnie's mind, we might think about alternative ways to do this experiment, variations on the experiment. One thing that people keep suggesting is that we change the experiment so that if Minnie sends $1, the experimenter sends $2, just as before, but if not, the extra $2 are burned. That way, Minnie can believe that her actions have no effect on, that her actions actually are affecting the world's wealth. That she's not just distributing. I just got a warning that my battery is running low. I got to plug my computer in. Hang on. We're okay. So then she can believe perhaps that she's not just redistributing the world's wealth, that she's actually affecting wealth. Okay? But that's crazy too. Because just a little bit of a computer problem. Hang on. Because now what she has forgotten, there's my slide, is that the dollars she gives to Mickey, instead of coming from this total stranger, are coming from another total stranger. Burning money affects the price level. The price level affects the wealth of people who are holding cash. It is just as true as ever that handing money to the guy next door is going to redistribute income among strangers. Under one scenario, it affects this guy's wealth. Lost my cursor. Affects this guy's wealth. Under another scenario, it affects this guy's wealth, but it still affects somebody's wealth. It still looks to me like Minnie is doing something that looks either like paying for the privilege of redistribution or being a magical thinker. Now, you might say I'm being a little hard on Minnie. After all, maybe she hasn't taken a class in monetary theory. A lot of people have not studied monetary theory. Maybe she doesn't realize all the ramifications of burning money. Maybe she doesn't realize the ramifications of changing the money supply, how it affects the price level, how that affects other people's wealth. Maybe if we sent her to a monetary theory class, she would behave differently. But that shouldn't matter. She shouldn't need that class because the monetary theory is beside the point. You don't need to understand the monetary theory. All you need to understand is that if Minnie gives up $1 and Mickey gets 3, the other 2 must have come from someplace. A class in monetary theory might help you understand where it came from. But knowing that the other $2 came from somebody, that's not monetary theory, that's basic arithmetic. And Minnie seems to be overlooking it. So, Minnie either just loves redistributing other people's wealth or she's a magical thinker. And I think it would be interesting to maybe change the experiment so that instead of dollars being burned, cookies were being destroyed. Now, Minnie would have an actual effect on cookies. Are unlike money, cookie is actual wealth. There's actual wealth at stake. I wonder whether that would change Minnie's behavior. I also wonder what would happen if you were to replace Minnie with an economics major. Because if we're doing our jobs well, then economics majors should at least be cured of magical thinking. And I suspect they're also less likely to be compulsive redistributionists because economics majors have been trained to think about social welfare functions that treats everybody equally. In fact, there is some good evidence that economics majors behave differently. In the United States, we have an organization called Affordable Tuition Now. This is an organization that lobbies for what they call sensible tuition rates, by which they mean lower tuition rates, at public colleges and universities. In other words, this organization lobbies for the redistribution of income from non-students to students. They lobby for the redistribution of income from non-students to students. Another thing this organization does is they solicit donations from college students. And guess what? The economics majors give the least. Economics majors are the people least likely to donate to this organization. Why might that be? You can read more about the facts in two articles written by the same authors. This one appeared in the New York Times. Another one somehow made it into an academic journal. And the authors of these articles say that, yes, economics majors give less. And the only possible explanation, according to these authors, the explanation that they find not just obvious but compelling, is that it must be because economics students are greedier. Greedier. Economics students are greedier. There we go. They are less generous. They are selfish. They are free riding on the contributions of the other students. And that's greed. That's what the authors believe. I found that so implausible that when I first read it, I thought I must have misunderstood what they were saying. I must have misread it. But I ended up having a very long, very public conversation with one of these authors. It started on my blog and then it spilled over onto other people's blogs. And he confirmed repeatedly that, yes, this is exactly what he meant to say. The only explanation for this difference in donations is that economics students are greedier. That's his theory. Here's mine. My first theory is that economics students are less greedy. They are less comfortable taking money from strangers to benefit themselves and their friends. The students who are trying to force other people to give them money, those are the ones these authors called less greedy. The economics students are not willing to do that. They feel a little squeamish about that, maybe. That looks to me like less greed. Also, economics students are less likely to engage in magical thinking. They're more aware that somebody has to be footing the bill for this stuff. Or to combine both points together, economics students are both more aware of and more sympathetic to other people's problems. They're both more aware of and more sympathetic to other people's problems. And that makes sense to me because economics is the science of caring about other people's problems. It's the science that demands that we put ourselves into the shoes of people who are very different than we are, people with different preferences, facing different constraints, facing different incentives. It's the science that demands that we put ourselves in other people's shoes and think hard about how they cope with life. It is the science that requires us to think about the circumstances that led someone to become a teacher, to think about the dilemmas that arise when you're adopting a child in a world full of uncertainty. It's the science that reminds us to be more thoughtful and more effective when we're figuring out the best way to be charitable. It's the science that reminds us to care about what's not seen, to remember that the stranger across the table might be no worthier or more deserving than the stranger down the road. It's the science that requires us, even when we take on a seemingly frivolous question, like why do people stand still on stairs but not on escalators? We still face that question by thinking hard about other people's goals and their strategies for accomplishing those goals. Every one of those things is an exercise in thinking about and caring about other people's problems. Economics is the science of compassion. Every year at graduation time, we send a new crop of students out to find their way in the world. And I talk to a lot of those students, and a lot of them, not the economics majors, but the history majors and the science majors and the English majors. I see them agonizing over what they see as a choice between a life of social responsibility and a life of material success. But the economics majors, when we've done our job right, know that that's a false dichotomy. They know that the truth is more nearly the opposite. They know that by and large, and with important exceptions to be sure, but by and large, the only way you know that you're doing something socially useful is that somebody is willing to pay you to do it. To choose a career without regard to prices would be as silly as trying to allocate vaccines without regard to prices. To my strongest economics students, that's obvious. To most other people, to most of the other students, what seems obvious is exactly the opposite. This rather dour-looking fellow is the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein once asked somebody, why is it that for so many centuries, people believed that the sun orbits the earth? Why did people think that for so long? And the answer he got was, well, that's what it looks like. It looks like the sun orbits the earth. And Wittgenstein said, oh, what would it have looked like if the earth had orbited the sun? Nothing in this world is obvious in its own right. What's obvious to you depends on your habits of thought. One collection of habits is generally called common sense. It's what most people rely on. Another collection of habits is called economic theory. Common sense, economic theory, they often lead to very different perceptions of how the world works and of what's obvious about how the world works. And I always tell my students that when you need to choose between common sense and economic theory, it's a good idea to remember that common sense is the one that keeps telling you the earth is flat.
Thank you, Steve. That was very, very, very good. Very refreshing of the old logic, economics logic that taken seriously. And I'm glad you gave this talk because in Pakistan, we discuss this a lot and I frequently lose debates. So I'm glad you've come to my rescue. Economics is the science of compassion. I love that. Economics is the science of social responsibility. Great. I'm sure it'll excite a lot of people. Folks, raise your hands if you want to ask a question. But meanwhile, let's generalize this a little bit. What people accuse us economists, of a lot is being heartless, especially towards the poor. And you just made a very good case, a brilliant case, that economists are not oblivious to the poor, but actually think hard and come up with better solutions. So for a country like Pakistan, let's see you work your magic in economics and tell us, we have a huge social protection program. And this term social protection, I love your views on that. And this social protection has been given to us by many, many famous economists, where we are giving handouts. We're giving handouts per month, X dollars per month, ad infinitum to poor people without any test of graduation or test of need or whatever, but we just give them based on a poverty survey that we've done. Poverty survey is basically asking people questions on what they have. And that poverty survey says if they don't have enough, it uses a weird score. And below that score, people are supposed to not have enough and we're supposed to give them something. And this is a huge packing from economists in MIT, for example, in Harvard, many places. How would you see this and how would you analyze that?
Well, I am not familiar with the details of the program you're talking about. I do think, as a very general rule, I think, and I'm sure you face this all the time. Whenever an economist questions whether you are helping the poor in the most effective way or in the most efficient way or in the way that helps them the most for a given expenditure, you're always immediately accused of not caring about them. If you want to change anything about the way they're currently being helped, then that proves you don't care. I'm afraid I have to draw my examples from the United States because those are the ones I'm familiar with.
Go ahead.
But we had a situation in an American city a few years ago in Seattle. The city was housing poor people, homeless people, in some cases in $1 million apartments. There were apartments, fantastic luxury apartments with fantastic views, and they were putting poor people, homeless people, in these $1 million apartments and saying, look, we've done a wonderful thing for them. I think it was fair to ask, look, if you had $1 million apartment at your disposal, wouldn't it have been better to sell that apartment and give $100,000 each maybe to 10 poor people rather than give one of them $1 million apartment? When economists ask those questions, overwhelmingly people said, oh, well, you just don't want to see poor people living in nice places because you're mean. Or another example, we had a hurricane here in the city of New Orleans several years ago. Terrible hurricane. Pretty much destroyed the city. And we rebuilt that whole city. We rebuilt that whole city at a cost that was close to $1 million per resident of the city. And nobody ever seemed to stop and ask, would those people maybe rather each get $1 million cash and move to some other city rather than rebuilding? Asking those questions, it seems to mark you, as a person who doesn't care if these people get their city back. And these things are very, very silly and very easy to refute. But the fact that we've got to constantly be refuting them really, I think, has extremely bad consequences for the way policies get carried out.
Very good point. Very good. Let me question Amir Durrani.
Yeah, so Stephen, my question is going to be very basic because you almost alluded to that. You brought in tax between the example of Minnie and Mickey. So two choices. I pay tax in a country. I know this is being very simplistic, but again, it's, you started your question with some basic hypothesis that I think comes with intuition. So please allow me to not place the context. My first question, you have the choice to pay tax, right, to a country in, let's say, country one. You move to country two, and you know that when you give this tax to whatever, the government, the state, or whoever controls redistribution, they're just going to redistribute it equally amongst everybody and not make fiscal allocation decisions, okay? So which scenario plays out better? I'm talking about UBI. I don't see Naseem here, but it's his favorite question. That's number one. My second question is the difference between giving poor people something or making them work for it. Which is better? Okay, so there's very simplistic questions, but I would like the answer to the first one, if you can, please. I'm more interested in that.
I think as a general rule, if you are holding fixed the amount of expenditure, if you're holding fixed the tax burden and holding fixed the amount of expenditure, it is generally better to give people money than to set up programs to help them for two reasons. One of which is you don't always know what they need, and they know what they need better than you do. But the second reason, which I suspect is even more important in practice, is that a lot of times this money gets handed out by people who not only don't know what people need, but also don't very much care what people need. And they would rather spend that money, we're going to put solar panels on all these people's houses because I happen to have a friend in the solar industry, right? So really it's two things. Even if the people doing the allocation mean well, they don't have the information necessary to make wise allocations usually. I'm sure there are exceptions. And second of all, they don't always mean well, and they don't usually mean well. It's very tempting when you have a lot of money to give out to try to give out a lot of it to your friends. And it's very tempting to convince yourself even that you're doing a good thing when you give it to your friends. So if you can take that discretion away, then I think that's generally a better way to go.
Well, Doctor, I'm not going to ask you to bother you with the same question. There are many hands. But Dr. Saab, please let's have this debate on UBI sooner rather than later. Because I think you just got an answer from a person who was very impressed with this presentation. Stephen, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yes, Khurram Shabir.
Okay, Professor Stephen, so I read one of your articles. It was an old article where you spotted one of the politicians. It was that politician, I don't remember his name, but he was against the income tax, the direct tax, while he was promoting the sales tax. So in your article, you defended his whatever his objection was, and you said that you wrote that the sales tax is much more like feasible. It's much better in that article. So I don't know if your opinion still holds like now, but don't you think that sales tax is much more like regressive? It creates much more like inequality based on that like article which I read was like very old, I think 2009, I think. So what's your take on that, sir? Thank you.
A sales tax does not have to be regressive. You can make it as progressive as you want to. You can have a higher tax rates for people who are buying more. The simplest way to do that is to, in any given year, look at a person's income, look at how much that person saved, and the difference is what he spent, and that's what you charge effectively a sales tax on. You can call it a consumption tax, you can call it a sales tax, and you can make that as progressive as you want. So I don't think that's an issue. The main problem with the income tax is that part of the definition of income tax, at least the definition we use in the United States, is that it includes taxes on capital income like interest and dividends. And income, and what that means is that you get taxed much more heavily on if I earn $1, this would be easier with a blackboard, sorry, but look, and a tax on capital income is equivalent to a sales tax that grows every year, because if I earn money this year and I wait 5 years to spend that money after having earned some interest on it, I'm going to pay a certain amount of tax. If I wait 10 years to spend it, then I'm going to pay a higher tax. So you are effectively paying it. The tax burden on you, assuming everything you earn is eventually spent by you or your heirs. So to a first approximation, it doesn't matter whether we tax it as income when it comes in or as a sales tax when it goes out. But ideally, we would set a sales tax level, or maybe different sales tax levels for different incomes. You can make it progressive, but you would have a sales tax schedule that does not change from year to year, because we don't want to incentivize people. Any tax is going to disincentivize work. Any tax is going to disincentivize some things, but we do not want to add an additional disincentive to save. We don't want to add an additional disincentive to spend in the years when you would most like to spend. The income tax encourages you to spend early rather than late. The sales tax treats all years equally, assuming that we're not constantly adjusting the tax rates. It's one more distortion that we eliminate, and it's an important distortion. This is an idea that came in the mid-90s from papers by people like Ken Judd and Chris Chamley. I think no economists took them very seriously at the beginning, but over decades, the people who work in that field, optimal taxation, the optimal taxation area of public finance, have pretty much all been drawn over to the idea, have all been won over to the idea that this is the right way to do taxes, that if we can avoid taxing capital income, again, this is completely independent of the question of progressivity. You can make a consumption tax as progressive as you want. But as I said, any tax is going to have bad disincentive effects. One of those disincentive effects is the incentive to spend early rather than late. That happens to be one of the most destructive of the disincentive effects, and you can get rid of that by not taxing capital, and that means not taxing income.
Professor Stephen, thank you for your wonderful lecture. I have a question regarding the ChatGPT. As you told us earlier that it's not giving us the perfect answers, so it's not giving us a thorough answers. But on the other hand, ChatGPT, it passed the US medical licensing exam. So there are other examples as well. So my question is, because do you think that over the time, people are using ChatGPT and it will reduce emotions in our daily life? And what will be the effect on civilizations? Will be mechanical, or do you think it will significantly affect us? How do you see it?
I think it is very, very interesting that it passed that medical exam. It makes me much less confident in my doctor. it cannot think about economics, and it can say a lot of things, quoting them from textbooks. But when it comes to applying them to a situation it hasn't seen before, it gets them wrong every time. I showed you 3 questions, but I've given it a lot of questions. It gets them wrong every time. Now, when I go to my doctor, maybe, I don't know, I'm not a doctor. Maybe everything my doctor sees, maybe every question I have is identical to a question he's had 40 times before. And so maybe the bot learns how to handle that. That's not true in economics. I'm a little suspicious about whether it's true in medicine either. In economics, we're constantly facing new situations where we have to take the principles we know about and apply them in new ways. The bot can't do that. Why it's passing that medical exam? Maybe it means it's a really bad exam. Maybe it means that medicine is very different than economics. I don't know. As for what's going to happen in the future, I don't know what ChatGPT is going to be able to do in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. Maybe it will be passing my exams. And in many ways, I hope it does. The more things that the bots can do and do well, the better off we are, at least if we employ them wisely. I have no idea what it's going to be able to do in a few years. And all I can tell you is that it cannot pass my exams right now. And I believe that the ability to pass my exams is highly correlated with the ability to make wise policy.
Steve, another question that I would like to raise with you. Think of the issue of public goods, for example. I mean, one place that the government gets a lot of leeway. I mean, 2 places the government grows very rapidly. In Pakistan, we've estimated that the footprint of the government is 75% of GDP or something like that, which is a huge number. And we've also estimated the cost of regulation, something like 50% of GDP. So, just thinking about it, how does that happen? Couple of places the government gets an edge is because the government always assumes that there are more, that they have a clear idea of what public goods are desirable and what the people need. Now, how can we think of public goods or solicit good? It's how can we use economics to solicit individual preferences or individual demand for the public good, or the society's demand for the public good through individual revelation of preference, or alternatively, the kind of inequality that society wants. Because what we are trying to do now is create absolute equality, and we are putting in all kinds of measures for that. And 2, I think we are overproducing public goods, at least in Pakistan and maybe also in the world. How do you react to that?
There are obviously, we all know, standard valid textbook arguments for why there are reasons why governments should supply public goods. There are also a lot of reasons why they shouldn't, and those come down to what we've already talked about, not having the information necessary to know what's demanded, not having the information necessary to know what is the cost of supply, although, of course, the more governments use prices, the better they'll do at that. But also the other one that so often I think gets overlooked, which is corruption. Corruption in a very broad sense. Corruption, I'm not talking about evil people, but I'm talking about people who manage to convince themselves that the things that they want to spend money on are good for other people. And that's a very human fallacy to fall into. But again, once you give people the ability to spend other people's money, they're going to fall into it. So you got to trade those things off against each other. Now, as far as figuring out what public goods are demanded, there are all kinds of mechanisms. There are things called Clark taxes in the public finance literature, where you set up a very complicated system. People tell you how much they value the public good, and you set up an incentive system that gets them to reveal honestly how much they value the public good. Putting these things into practice has not proved terribly easy, partly because it's hard to get people to understand how the system works. You're incentivizing them, but the incentives are kind of complicated, and they don't understand what the incentives are. And if they don't understand the incentives, they can't react to them. So I don't have any general solution to this. I think one needs to be aware that public goods are going to be underprovided if you don't let the government provide them. They're likely to be overprovided if you do let the government provide. And you've somehow got to strike some kind of a compromise where you are letting the government provide some public goods and making sure that they are constrained so that it doesn't get completely out of hand. The way to do that is a political question that I'm not sure I have a lot of insight into. And if I did, all of my insight would be based on the United States and probably would not apply to your country.
Fair enough, fair enough. But now let me draw your attention to another subject, which I think would be interesting, which relates to the mini mouse example. We have, where I sit in developing the poor countries, we have a whole paraphernalia of international agencies who are playing mini mouse with us. They've got lots of money given by lots of countries, and they are here telling us to lending money to us, and we get into trouble. And you probably read that famous book, Diary of an Economic Hit, familiar with that argument. But I'm not trying to make that argument. I'm trying to make the argument that how do you see the incentives of two kinds of people? One is the World Bank and the donor agencies, and two is development economists, like, for example, Banerjee and Duflo got the Nobel Prize for RCTs, etc. Because there's a whole industry out there that is prescribing for our country with money that is easily accessible only to them, not to us. For example, we can't even compete for the same money that Duflo and Banerjee get, but they get all that money and they use that money to experiment on us, and it's a good industry. So how do you react to that, and how do you think that we should deal with it?
Boy, I am sure you have thought about this much harder than I have. So I am not the person who should be giving advice to you on that. But I'd be interested to hear more of your thoughts on that if you want to share a few.
No, I'd like to hear you analyze that problem. Let's simply think this problem is given to you. How would you analyze it?
I'm not sure I have anything to say beyond the things I've already said. That people handing out other people's money are not going to always hand it out very wisely or very beneficently. Do you have a sort of a specific example of funds that you think have been spent very unwisely in Pakistan because of these agencies?
I can think of so many things. For example, take this, the Jeff Sachs famous thing of MDGs, for example, of the SDGs. You know about those things? Now,
Yes.
MDGs, SDGs, those are yardsticks that have been given globally to all poor countries,
Right.
and they're scrambling to meet them, and they can't meet them. I'm not sure whether all the goals are something that every country be achieving the same goals, but yet.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I am sure the answer to that is no. Problems are very, very different from one country to the next, and again, I am sorry to say that I know almost nothing about the problems that are specific to Pakistan.
Fair enough. No, this is not Pakistan. I'm talking about more generally, but nevertheless, let's take Mahmood Khalid. Go ahead, Mahmood.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you very much, Professor Stephen. It's an excellent talk which you have given to us. I am right now sitting in a border city of Pakistan called Quetta. And the problem which yesterday I discussed with the Revenue Collection Authority chairman was that they put up taxes on the traded goods. And what happens is that instead of the tax collection, all the machinery which is in the way to inspect and collect taxes start collecting bribes instead of taking money and putting it in the government's coffer. So he asked me this simple question: what should we do? Should we simply take away the taxes? At least that is going to provide some relief to the traders, at least, because the money is not going to come to the government. Or should we think about maybe reducing the incentives of the ones which are taking bribe indirectly, and think about maybe charging taxes in a sense that whenever the product comes in our country, that is already tax included. And for that, they have actually started a barter trade system as well, in which practically there is going to be no taxes involved in either side. It's going to be good versus goods. So how do you see this problem in which policies are made, but when it comes to the arm's length in which the persons who are going to implement those policies think opposite? It's a typical agency problem. How does the government solve these kinds of crises in their governance structures?
Well, the import taxes, even without the corruption, the import taxes are probably doing a lot of harm. So I would always like to see those taxes reduced. Even if all that money goes into the government coffers, even in the best case scenario where the government spends it wisely, you still have cut off a lot of trade. And I think that countries like Pakistan really need trade. There are a lot of things that are not produced in Pakistan that Pakistanis want to buy, and so I would certainly want to focus on reducing the taxes. And if the argument for doing that you can sell to the politicians is that the taxes cause corruption, I would go ahead and use that argument. But I think getting rid of the taxes would be a good thing in its own right.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. That was a wonderful lecture. I really appreciated it. As I said, it got me back to the Chicago core. I felt like I was taking the core in. So thank you. Thank you. Very nice of you. Keep us inundated with your great problems and ideas. And we'll bother you now and again. Please help us again and give us a talk. It's a great education experience for our kids here.
All right.
So with that, thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye.